Hi, Jason, can you hear me before we start? Okay, so I can't hear you. Okay, we have 4 people waiting. So welcome everybody. If you can just hold on for a second while we sort out a few technicalities. So Jason, do you have your microphone switched on?
Is it on now?
It is.
There we go.
Well, okay, so we're ready to go.
Excellent.
Well, welcome to everybody who's here to attend this webinar on GDPR, a very, very interesting subject. I'd like to introduce Jason, who's got his football shirt on by the look of it, I think.
Yeah, it's an Italian shirt, but
we're not going
to offend anybody.
We're not here to talk about football. We're here to talk about GDPR. And Jason, just to give you a bit of background, he's been in Toastmasters for 10 years and has carried out almost all the roles. His latest role was Area 59 Area Director, and he's a member of Lewisham Speakers. And in terms of Jason's GDPR experience, well, what can I say? He's a business analyst and is responsible for GDPR in a bank. So I'm going to hand over to you, Jason.
Hi, everybody. Hi, my name's Jason Thompson. I'm really glad to everybody who's given up a little bit of time on their Sundays to dive into the very exciting topic of GDPR. So I'm hoping that it's going to be interesting, informative, educational, and at the end of the session, you have a little bit more of a grasp of really what the essence of GDPR is all about, and actually what you can do to help your clubs be, I hate to use the word compliant, but compliant with the regulation. During the webinar, we've got a few slides. What I'd like you to do is, during the presentation, if there's any questions that come up, please type them into the chat. And at the end of the presentation, or a spot somewhere, we will start going through those questions. So I think the Q&A is going to be very useful for all of us to share our experiences and our queries and our concerns and maybe some other stuff as well. So I'm going to turn my beautiful picture off, and we're going to start cracking in to the topic. So first, just a quick overview of where we're going. I'm going to try not to make it too death by PowerPoint, but GDPR is a bit of a dry subject, so there's not much more we can do to alleviate that, but we're going to try our best to keep it a little bit light. So first off, we're going to set a little bit of context, because I really want to focus on what GDPR is and how it relates to Toastmasters and who we are. Then I'm going to have a little overview of GDPR in terms of identifying what the key things that we really need to be concerned about. The next part is going to be how do we set ourselves up for success, and then towards the end we're going to have some questions. So let's go. What is Toastmasters' mission? Well, as Toastmasters, our role is to empower individuals to become more effective communicators and leaders. In a nutshell, we are doing good stuff for people. We aren't trying to sell them double glazing or a used car or a loan they don't need. We are working with people who become our friends, our evaluators, our coaches, to help us all become more effective communicators and leaders. So we are doing fairly heroic stuff. And I thought I'd just, a little picture of, this is the kind of clubs that this is the kind of organization that we're part of. We're not a business to a large extent. We're a non-profit organization. Hardly anybody gets paid unless you're actually in headquarters. Whoa, something really funky going on here. Hardly anyone ever gets paid.
Right, Jason, can I just interrupt? We can't see your screens.
I know something.
So
weird
I'm sorry. I'm fiddling. I'm pressing some buttons.
Okay.
You know, I'm one of those people who will press every button. So forgive me for that.
That's no worries.
There we go.
So anyway, so in a nutshell, the relationship we have between members is really one of colleagues, as friends, and So it's that type of relationship. It's not adversarial for the most part in any way, although I'm sure people in there can have different experiences. And perhaps that could be something that comes up in the questions. So let's talk about GDPR as an overview. And let's talk about, firstly, what is personal data? So GDPR is really focused around protecting data of individuals, and that's preventing organizations abusing the data of individuals. So, preventing them to selling them to organizations for profit, to, for example, try and rig elections, as we found out with recently the whole scenario around Cambridge Analytica, letting us know when there's actually a breach of data. So when someone's left the USB stick on a train with 10,000 tax records, not keeping it quiet, letting us know. So I think what it's trying to do is create a culture where we look after, or organizations look after, the data that's been provided to them by individuals. And the reason why that's so important, because data essentially is the foundation of the economy that we're moving into. We're moving into more information oriented digital economy. We're all participants in that, whether we're buying stuff from Amazon or going onto a website, or giving our information to Google or Facebook. And I think more people will be inclined to share their information if they can rely on those organizations they share it with to be trustworthy. So it covers personal data, any information related to an identified or identifiable natural person in the EU. So we're talking about name, address, phone number, your license plate details, pretty much anything that could be related to who you are. So, for example, the street name, a postcode of your house would be personal data. Processed by automated or partially automated means, anything effectively that resides on a computer is covered, but it also cover personal data that's in filing cabinets. So, for example, your dentist practice or your doctors, or if you go to a massage therapist, for example, they may have paper-based records that are filed in order of surname at their particular practice. GDPR covers that also. Out of scope would be information which is maintained by individuals for domestic purposes. So the list of your friends and family phone numbers on your Apple or your iPhone is not going to be covered by GDPR. The territorial scope is which countries is this regulation enforced. GDPR has what we call extraterritorial scope. So it's not plainly focused on protecting data of EU citizens or residents based in the EU, but also if their data goes out into third countries such as US, Canada, China, for example, it's also protected there. So the basic idea is wherever data of EU citizens travels anywhere around the world, it's protected by GDPR. So it affects companies based in the EU, it affects companies based outside the EU or working with EU personal data, and it includes companies that are offering products and services to data subjects based in the EU. If you've got any questions, by all means, just put them into the chat and we will pick them up towards the end. So, for example, going back over the last slide, what we've got here is a spreadsheet and a filing cabinet. It's a quiz, but I'm going to tell you the answer. A pile of business cards on your desk or in your wallet will not be classed as personal data for the fact that it's printed record and it's not filed or organized in any way. So why do people care so much about GDPR? Well, I suppose to enable people to take notice of the rules, especially large companies such as your Facebooks and your Googles, you have to have fairly substantial penalties for infringing GDPR. So for GDPR, the fines can be up to 4% of global turnover, which is enough to make most companies think twice about how they're looking after people's data. They also have to pay compensation for any damages suffered. So, for example, if I had some information or sensitive personal data that I didn't want to be put into public knowledge, for example, about my health, for example, I could, if that was to affect my rights in any way, so if it prevented me from getting a job, I could claim compensation for that. And again, if there was any sensitive personal data that was leaked into the public as a result of a GDPR infringement, I could also, if it affected my reputation in any way, then I could also claim for that. So effectively, they've just put heavy financial penalties on companies and organizations that aren't compliant. The GDPR at its heart is what they call principle-based regulation, which it means, in a nutshell, they don't give hard and fast rules, but expect companies, organizations, let's just talk about companies, organizations that handle personal data to adhere to the principles and embody the spirit of data protection. And as such, it means it's very hard for companies to claim there wasn't a rule that prevented them from taking a particular course of action. So with rules-based regulation, there's always loopholes. There's always the fact that if someone doesn't specify something in a specific way, you can always find a loophole in the law. So whereas principle regulation, so well, actually, are you adhering to the spirit of the regulation? And that then becomes a much more vague interpretation, which is designed to catch people trying to look for loopholes, but at the same time makes it very difficult to follow in a very regimental way. So from a GDPR perspective, the ICO being the UK regulator, compliance with the spirit of these key principles is going to be a fundamental building block for good data protection. And it's particularly important for Toastmasters. We really focus on the principles and really thinking about, from the perspective of the data subjects, what is the right thing to do to be aligned with GDPR. It may not be the best thing to do, but whatever best means is very much dependent upon your circumstances. So the techniques that Facebook or Google use to protect personal data based upon their budget and resources is probably going to be a lot more comprehensive than what we're going to be able to do as a Toastmasters club. So it's kind of adopting an approach which can be tailored to the organization based upon their resources. There are 6 core principles in GDPR. We've got lawfulness and fairness of processing, which is where data subjects must give consent, or essentially there must be a legitimate basis for which organizations are processing personal data, and that the way that when we say we're going to process personal data in a specific way, that we actually do it in that way and we don't do anything else with the data. Purpose intent, we've got to tell people why we're using their personal data, what it's going to be used for. We've got to be very specific and explicit about that. Data minimization effectively means not collecting any more data than we should. So in the case of Toastmasters, we wouldn't be expected to be asking for people's addresses up to 3 or 4 years ago. We're not a credit reference organization, so we don't really necessarily need that information. But it should be limited to what we actually need the data for. It's got to be accurate and up to date. So from a Toastmasters perspective, we've got members who have been in the club for a couple of years and we know they've moved. We should encourage them to update their data. We shouldn't keep data for any more longer than necessary. So we're talking about data retention. So if someone leaves a club, we should think about how long do we need to keep the data on easy speak after they've left the club. And then security. Security can be looked at in lots of different ways, and we'll probably explore that later in the call. But at its core, we're talking about information security. So we should ensure that personal data is password protected. So, for example, if it's on a platform, you need a username and password to gain access to it. If it's on a spreadsheet that's shared between multiple club officers, then ideally the spreadsheet should be have a username and password protected as well. Lawfulness and fairness of process. And in the first slide, we talked about having a legitimate basis for processing data. And there are 6 legitimate bases, 3 of which don't apply to us at all. Vital interests, legal obligation, and public task, unless we're involved in saving people's lives, or then vital interest is not going to apply. It's obviously we're not a government organisation, and there is no legal obligation for a Toastmasters club to exist, let alone handle personal data on that basis. But the basis we will typically use will be consent for handling personal data. There's a multiple number of reasons for this. I think the size of our clubs and the relationship we have with our members would mean that consent is probably actually fairly easy for us to obtain. However, in some cases, we may have legitimate interests to process personal data, i.e., for example, if we're contacting members to renew their annual dues for payment, we may not want to ask for consent to do that, because really it's part of an obligation of a member to pay their dues. So in that type of relationship, we would have legitimate interest to find out whether a member is actually going to pay their dues for next year or whether they're going to leave the club. We wouldn't, if we're asking consent to contact members to chase them for dues, then if a member says no, then there won't be a conversation about dues. So it's something really to think about when we're using consent and when we don't need to use consent. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat, and we'll pick them up towards the end of the webinar. If I'm going too fast also, feel free to tell me to slow down. So we couldn't really talk about GDPR without talking about the rights of the data subject, because effectively these are the things that we need to make sure that we do. So the right to be informed, which is effectively where we're going to focus this call, is really around making sure we give the appropriate notices to members and guests about how we're going to use the data. So that covers your privacy notices, your consent forms, your privacy policies, if your club has them. And we'll talk about a few of those things in the next few slides. We've got things like the right to erasure, the right to be forgotten, right to restrict processing, right to data portability. I think we could get very, involved in looking at these particular things. I would guide against not putting too much emphasis on the right to be forgotten and the right to restrict processing and the right to data portability, because really most of the data exists. I mean, most of the data that we obtain is given to us by the member. So it's actually their data. We're not necessarily adding anything to it apart from the educational records, which we can print out. But portability is really around, for example, if you're British Gas and you want to move your data to Scottish Power, facilitating that type of economic trade, rather than thinking about moving data between Toastmasters clubs. Any questions about any of those rights which you would like to speak a little bit more, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll pick those up later. So that's all fine and dandy. What do we actually have to do? How are we actually going to make our clubs, I hate to say the word compliant because I think compliance is more of a journey, but how are we going to ensure that our clubs are keeping within the spirit of GDPR? So if the regulator ever comes along, we can hold our hands up high and say, hey, we did the best we could with what we have. So we like rules of 3 in Toastmasters, and I've come up with a GDPR rule of 3. And the 3 principles are transparency, let's be open with our members and guests. Let's tell them how and where data is going to be used. Security, ensure that your data, any data you capture, is adequately protected. So we're talking about usernames and passwords. And if we're sharing data with other organizations or on cloud-based platforms, let's make sure that we've got usernames and passwords for those. And then accountability, being able to demonstrate that your club is adhering to the principle of GDPR. So that really comes in the form of managing your consent. So if we're collecting consents, making sure those are kept somewhere safe. So for example, you're collecting paper-based consents on whether a new guest or a guest wants to be contacted about the next meeting or a particular event, make sure we capture those consents on a sign-up sheets and we file them somewhere. So if anyone says, hey, you didn't have consent to share my data, then make sure we've got somewhere we can say, yes, you did give us consent. The other thing would be, for example, being able to show that you've got a record of the different processes that you're using, personal data for. So keeping an inventory of the different systems and people you share personal data with. Because essentially what that will do is give any regulator, any outside party, the confidence that you know what you're doing with your data. So the first thing is creating a personal data inventory. So in a Toastmasters club, typically we will do multiple things with personal data. So we will say, starting with guests. So a guest will join our club. We will have a process where we send information to guests. So it could be guest registration, for example. That's an activity where we're processing personal data. So we'll have, you imagine an Excel spreadsheet, you'll have guest registration on one side. Identify what data is being collected and for whom. So for guest registration, we may collect a name, an email address, and a phone number, and it's for a guest. That will be the person we're collecting it for. Why are we collecting it? Well, the purpose could be for contacting members. What's the lawful basis? The lawful basis would be they've given us consent. So we're going to make sure we're capturing, when we're creating our personal data inventory, we know that for each process, we know exactly what lawful basis we're going to be using. Capture the systems we're using for processing. So for a member sign-up sheet, you could be capturing a piece of paper and then maybe adding it to an Excel spreadsheet that you keep in Dropbox, for example, or on Google, whatever it's, Google Drive. Identify who this data is shared with. Well, you may share it with other club officers, and in terms of retention period, you'll keep it for, I don't know, say 12 months. It shouldn't be anything particularly excessive. So it'd be interesting to know if anyone's actually started making any type of inventory or registry of how they're processing personal data, whether they think this is too much or too little. Please feel free to add that in the chat. Privacy policies. So a lot of you would have received emails from multiple sources. I think my inbox at one day just before the 25th of May, when GDPR went live, was completely full of them. A privacy policy really essentially explains to the world what you're doing with personal data. It's very useful to have, because if you don't have a privacy policy, you effectively don't have a written down guide as to what you're supposed to be doing with personal data, which is when the chances of the ICO ever knocking are quite remote. But if they ever knock and you don't have a privacy policy, then they'll just start scratching their chin and say, okay, do these guys really know what they should be doing with personal data? And that's when they start looking into your processes in a lot more detail. So by having a privacy policy, you're kind of really speaking to that area of accountability to say, yes, we know what we should be doing with personal data, and we have a privacy policy for our club. And that helps to reassure all outside parties, guests in particular, prospective guests who are just looking at our website and thinking about, okay, is this a serious organization? We have a privacy policy that speaks to these things, then we'll be more or less covered. Issue privacy notices. So in addition to having a privacy policy that probably goes on the website, or it could be in your, when you're receiving guests and members to your meeting, it could be next to the sign-up sheet. We have the club privacy notice. Now, Toastmasters International have issued a club privacy notices that should be on the D91 website and also on toastmasters.org. And that is tailored for new members upon joining, and probably existing members of the club, to ensure that members give their consent to processing of personal data. So already what we should be doing is ensuring that all of our existing members, if we haven't captured their consents already on some kind of platform, whether it be EasySpeak or if you're using MailChimp, something like that, then we should be using this approach for capturing the consent of individual members and ensuring that these privacy notices, once filed, are kept somewhere reasonably safe. Members' privacy policy and guidelines. So when we talk about a members' privacy policy, what we've got to bear in mind is that it's not just club officers who have access to personal data of other members in the club. We actually all have access. Any one of our members at some point could be selected to be the Toastmaster of a particular meeting, and they, in the course of their role, will need to reach out to individual members to enroll them in a particular role or get them to speak or what have you. So as a club, each of us needs to be mindful about how we're handling the personal data of our fellow members. So for example, I may have, and I'm sure many of you have done this before, I may have a distribution list of members for Lucian speakers, and I may decide to share that list with, I don't know, Greenwich, for example, or Meridian speakers to contact them. So in your members' privacy policy, what you probably do is state that, for example, that's something you could do. You could be sharing data with other clubs. You could have a policy that speaks around the use of photos, and I know that many of us in our clubs like to capture photos of the table topics winner or the best speaker of a meeting, and sometimes we'll maybe share that photo on Facebook or whatever particular platform of social media you use. The policy should be covering the use of photos on social media. So we should be saying, okay, what's our policy? Our policy should be ideally to ensure that if we take a photo of someone and we want to share it on social media, that we have their consent to do that. Because otherwise, what could happen is to say, hang on a second, one day you're on Facebook or you're on Google Images and you find a picture of yourself winning the Table Topics Awards as a guest, and no one's ever asked you to share that photo, which is now available to the whole world. So as a members' privacy policy, that's really about laying down some rules within our clubs to say, how are we going to handle the personal data of all of us? How are we going to enroll ourselves onto, how are we going to set up distribution lists, WhatsApp groups, any type of groups, and how we're going to do that with, putting the members' personal data interests at first. And then we have the consent form, and the consent form we use to capture the personal data, use of personal data for non-members, and exceptional uses of personal data for members. So, for example, all guests, if we want to be able to contact them after they attend the meeting, we should get consent. If we want to use personal data for existing members for something they've never asked or we've never specified in our privacy policy, say, for example, we want to share Barry's data with somebody in Rotarians because they want to have Barry McConnell over there to make a speech, then we should ask Barry for that permission, because it's unlikely that we would have specified that in our privacy policy. So, and we've got to be pretty strong on maintaining records. So we're going to make sure that we know where our inventory is, where our policies are, where our consent form templates are. We should make sure we review those annually. So if there are any changes, if we go from, for example, storing files on Google Drive to storing them on Dropbox, and we should make sure that that's reflected in our inventory. If there are any changes in how we want to use personal data, we should make sure our policies are updated. And for example, consents, for example, we should be making sure that we're reviewed regularly and aligned with changes in membership status. So if today I decide to leave my club, I should make sure that, if a member decides to leave your club, you should check with that member if they still want to be contacted by the club. So that's an area where we kind of really have to pay particular attention to. And then when we're looking at capturing consent, we should think about how we do it. We should maybe look at, for example, if you're creating a WhatsApp group for your list, for your club members, thinking about whether we automatically put them in the list because they're a member of the club, or whether we send them a link to enroll, we send them an invite to be part of the group. I know typically when I've been a VPE or a president of a club, we've just enrolled members. The fact that you're a member of the club, we will just put you straight into the WhatsApp group or into a distribution list. With GDPR, we should be a little bit more sensitive to individuals, and there are specific needs to be included or not be a part of a group. We should make sure we give that some thought. I know I've rattled through this incredibly quickly, but I'd really like to take your questions, because I think really there's so much out there in terms of GDPR. It's very difficult to boil that down into a half an hour presentation. So I'd really be keen if there are any questions for you to shoot. So I've got a really interesting question actually from Philip, who's talked about what is our obligation. So let me read the whole question out. In the case of rights not to be forgotten, in the unlikely case a member would like to be completely forgotten, what is our obligation regarding social media group pictures posted? Okay, so we're starting off with the fact that we've posted a member's picture on social media. That's a really difficult one, because if typically a member could be part of a group photo, okay, that's posted onto Facebook. So effectively what you would need to do, firstly, that Facebook would be we would have passed that data onto Facebook. We would need to ask, or actually it wouldn't be it would need to be the specific member would need to request to Facebook to have that picture removed or edited. Now that is quite a complicated task. So it would effectively be down to, the way it would probably work would be for the member to tell the club they wanted a particular picture taken down, and for the club to take that picture down from that particular social media site. Now, the problem with that is it's quite easy that anybody who has access to that picture could have downloaded it and posted that onto any site. So our obligation specifically would be, if it's a picture of, it would depend on the circumstances. If it's a picture of a specific individual that we've posted, we should be able to remove that picture. But I don't think removing that picture itself is going to remove any traces of that person from Toastmasters, from being connected with Toastmasters. So our specific obligation will be to take the picture down of our Facebook site. Beyond that, there's not really much else we could do in the context of the resources that we have. But in terms of being completely forgotten from all our other systems, and of course we can delete them from EasySpeak. We can ask TI to ensure that they are removed from any data repositories that they have. But there's the right to forgotten is fairly tricky to actually implement, and it's very difficult for a Toastmasters club to implement.
Thanks, Jason. That's a really useful presentation, because I think for most of us, GDPR is a minefield, and it does need an expert like yourself to explain it. I'm mindful that quite a few people who are on the webinar may be new to the committee, because the new Toastmasters year has started. What would you say is the best thing for a new president or a new committee to do? What would be their first steps, do you think?
I think, good point. I think the first step, the very first step would be to really identify within the new committee who is going to look after the area of personal data. Because if you don't make somebody responsible, then it's pretty much certain that no one's going to take responsibility for anything. So the first thing would be to ensure that one person, the recommendation is a club secretary. Say, for example, the club secretary is responsible for the privacy policy, ensuring that ensuring that every member of a club has signed the Toastmasters International consent form, ensuring that there are consent forms available, or there's a consent notice available on the sign-up sheet, and making sure that all the kind of documentation is available and in place, and ensuring that everyone knows how to use it. So when we welcome guests to our club, they'll be the person to make sure, okay, have you made sure that we've got a consent form put out there for our guests? Have we got our consents to email people? And I think whoever's the secretary would take the lead, but I think everybody in the club kind of needs to know what the rules are around contacting guests and contacting members. But the secretary or someone in the team should be reporting to lead that. Okay.
And speaking from personal experience, I recently sent out a mass communication on EasySpeak, because that's what our club uses. And I thought it would be really useful to invite visitors who'd previously attended the club. And I got a message saying that I was spamming, obviously, from EasySpeak. So my message then wasn't sent. So I had to resend it and not send it to our visitors.
Sorry, could you just repeat the last bit?
Yeah, so what happened, I can't remember the reason, but I wanted to communicate with everybody in the club. So I used the mass communication email option on EasySpeak. And you also have an option to invite previous visitors and guests, which I thought was a great idea, until I got a message back from EasySpeak to say that it was being considered as spam, and obviously is contravening the GDPR rules now. So I had to resend it to club members.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the things with using EasySpeak. It has lots of useful functionality that we can use. However, with GDPR, we have to be mindful about whether we're using it. So, for example, we're doing things like sending, inviting, what do you call it now, past members or past visitors. I suppose the basic principle is to ask, do we have consent to contact these people? So, for example, in the case of contacting members via, especially we're contacting members via EasySpeak, that should be fine, given that you've collected the consent. So really, the first thing you've got to think about is whether you've got consent, and then figuring about how you're going to contact those people. But I think a lot of I know at Lewisham we spend a lot of time clearing out our past visitors list, but I've seen still that we've got visitors on our list from years ago that haven't been in the club for a while, and really we can't really assume that anyone on a list has got consent. We have to make sure we've got it.
Yes. I'd just like to talk about Nadia's comment before we go back to Philip, because Philip has come back. Yeah. So Nadia is saying, and I think it's a really useful question, is there an inventory checklist available? Because that's what we all need, isn't it? We need something to remind us of the things we have to do.
I've got there's an inventory file attached with this presentation. Okay. I'm not sure if I can show it or not. Let's see how that works. There's an inventory file, and I've got some links at the end of this presentation as well. But there's an inventory file that's attached to this presentation. I don't know if I can do it. Okay.
Great. Well, thanks for the question, Nadia. And just to go back to Philip, so as we post a group picture after every meeting, would we then have to go back to all pictures with that member and take them down? And he hopes that we won't get such a request. We won't get a request.
Well, I mean, the thing with GDPR is that there were a lot of real kind of theoretical questions, but I think we do have to speak to them. I think you've got to start from the rights of the data subject, and if you don't, if a data subject decides to withdraw their consent for sharing personal data, then if a photograph is personal data, and if you're sharing it and they withdraw their consent, then yeah, I mean, you would need to at least consider taking it down. Now, how much effort that takes to comply with is a different kettle of fish. And I think if the request is deemed to be unreasonable, the ICO are going to look at it favorably, in our favor, so it's given the type of organization that we are, being a voluntary organization and not for profit, and actually being out there to try and help people. So I don't think it's something that we should, we're looking at taking a risk-based approach. I don't think it's something that we should be overly preoccupied about. That said, I think we need to make sure that we are placing, we have social media partners, so to speak, as in Facebook and Twitter and what have you, that they provide the facility to take any pictures down that we see fit. Okay,
perfect. You also touched on liability, and Barry O'Connell has got a question. And Barry is saying, if you're a member of a committee, are you liable for any breaches or failures, and what can you do, short of taking sole responsibility for everything GDPR, to limit your liability?
Okay, so say for example there was a data breach. I think from a liability perspective, I think we just need to show that being responsible. So if, depending on the volume of data that we're talking about, and depending on the nature of data we're talking about, say for example, there's a USB stick of club members containing a spreadsheet of club members that's been left in the pub after a meeting. Now, what you would do specifically is say to everybody in the club, hey, by the way, and this could be maybe one of those massive communication emails for the club. By the way, Barry left the USB stick in the pub after the meeting, and it had information of all our club members, and it had name, address, phone number, what have you. Please ensure that, if it's got email address, that you change, maybe change your email passwords, that kind of communication. Because effectively, what we need to do under GDPR is let our data subject know that their data has been lost. So where we get into trouble is not telling them, is not being open and transparent when things happen, which comes then back to data minimalization to say, if we minimize the amount of data we're collecting from members, then the risk of a data breach having a serious impact on our members is going to be reduced. So again, it's thinking about when we're capturing data or we're, moving data around, let's not have too much in one place. Let's not have name, address, postal address, phone number, the whole educational record and what have you. Let's not have that all in one place where someone in the club can breach it. If we're looking at a breach of Easy Speak, then whoever's responsible for Easy Speak should be telling the those affected or notifying those affected that there has been a breach of the data and this is the data that's been breached.
Okay, thank you for that. And there are some questions around the Easy Speak and some comments. So I'll just work through these. They may not be in a particular order, and apologies for that.
That's fine.
So Annalise said, it's an interesting thing that we also need to manage the relationship with the past members, as well as informing all our members about our processes. And Rory has sort of responded and said, we're no longer using Easy Speak for non-Toastmaster members, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because I think you want to have as much control as possible. I think it's really down for each club to look at the tools at its disposal, look at GDPR and think, okay, what's the best way of managing it? So for example, if you've got, I know in Easy Speak, and I haven't used it for a while, you've got members being separate from guests, and you've got features where you can decide whether you're going to email a guest or not. Now, decision to say, actually, we're only going to keep, we're going to use Easy Speak for members and maybe another platform such as, for example, MailChimp for guests is workable, because with MailChimp, it's quite easy for people to manage consent. So people can subscribe, they can unsubscribe, and you can manage consent fairly easily on such a tool, and it could be one approach. It really depends on what tools you have in place to capture and manage consent and how you're going to do it. I think with Easy Speak, it makes it more of a task to manage consent from guests, because it places a lot of onus on somebody going in. So for example, somebody could send me an email as I'm a club secretary and say, okay, I don't want to be emailed anymore. At that particular moment in time, I could be doing, because I'm doing this voluntary, I could be working. Therefore, it goes on my email list, and I'll do it maybe at some point in time. And that point may never happen. So that point between me actually executing the request and receiving the request, we're kind of in breach. If I never get around to doing it, then it's by every chance that person can receive an email and that person get quite peeved by doing it. So having a tool, it really depends on resources. We can have tools that manage consent for guests automatically. That's a far easier way of taking care of guests. And then once they've signed up to be members, then as members, they kind of sign up to being, as part of the policy, part of the members' privacy policy, being communicated with by other members.
Okay.
Within reason and given what we've specified in our privacy policy.
Okay, thank you. Well, one of the wonderful things about webinars is a sharing of information, and people are asking questions, and also other members are answering them. So
brilliant.
So it's amazing, isn't it? I'll quickly just run through these, make sure I haven't missed anything. Yuki asked who will be responsible for maintaining the information on Easy Speak. And then Rory has responded and saying that he uses MailChimp, as you've just mentioned, because Easy Speak makes people visible to all sorts of other random people. So they use MailChimp, which has an unsubscribe. So Yuki, I think, is lots of questions from Yuki, which Rory's answering. Okay, I'm getting slightly confused here, but I hope Yuki and Rory, brilliant. I think this is amazing.
Yeah. Rory's one of the data protection ninjas, so he's just using his ninja skills.
Yeah. so Mr. Ninja.
Yeah, he's produced a lot of content that I've actually got on file here for the group. He's done a great deal of work around burning the midnight oil around privacy notices, which I've completely stolen.
Okay, well that's good, and I think plagiarizing is a much nicer word.
Yes. Oh yeah, plagiarizing
You
it's
know,
much more elegant.
absolutely, and it's all about sharing, isn't it? And
Indeed.
and I think as Toastmasters clubs, we do get a little bit confused as to what our responsibilities are and what Toastmasters International responsibilities are. And also, because we're all doing pretty much the same thing, it would make sense that we all had a consistency. So I'm guessing that's what Rory is working on and sharing with all the clubs or via the districts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really tricky one, because I think, and this is just a personal comment for myself, I think TMI have been a little bit slow with regards to GDPR, which has probably meant that a few of us over on this side of the water have kind of picked a lot of things up. And I think over time, as the US become a little bit more familiar with GDPR and they get a little understanding, it is a journey that probably takes about 5 or 6 months to get your head around. We'll probably see some more, I suppose, coherent policies and approaches coming, but I think we do have to be in step with TI. And the funny thing is that we kind of have a really the relationship. We're not subsidiaries effectively of Toastmasters International. The clubs are themselves their own entities that collect data for their own purposes, and we share that with TI, who are also controllers and use data for their purposes. So, for example, a club will collect data, and we will use that data to set up meetings and organize meetings. TI will collect data for, they'll collect data for sending Toastmaster magazines, sending education awards, sending training guides out, etc. So both organizations will use data for different purposes simultaneously. So as clubs, we have responsibility for the data that we hold and being specific about the purpose that we use it. And then Toastmasters International also have the same set of responsibilities. So we're kind of working in partnership, because obviously data from us is shared with Toastmasters International, but Toastmasters International tell us what we need to share with them. So it's not that it's not that there's a complete separation, but there is a tight relationship, and it's a difficult one to balance. And I know initially Toastmasters International were pretty much saying it's nothing to do with us, it's all down to the clubs. But I think their view has changed since they've kind of picked up a little bit more about GDPR.
Okay, and I'm sure that's down to Pedro.
Absolutely.
The leadership team just banging on their door. And
yes.
Talk about a joint effort and sharing a partnership. Rory has responded, it's not stolen, it's a joint effort. There we go.
Always self-effacing, that guy. No, but it has been very much a joint effort, actually, because I think he was working on it very late at night and sending out WhatsApp messages to myself and a few others, and we were feeding back on a couple of bits and pieces. So yes, it was definitely collaborative.
Good. And yes, I'm sure it has been very frustrating, as Rory's also said, working with the people who run our organisation not taking it seriously enough. But hopefully all that's done, that's behind us now, and we can all move on and share our information and get to grips with GDPR. So
absolutely.
We have a few minutes left. If there are any more questions, perhaps you can put them in the chat box. And I think, Jason, I went back to saying about our new committees and our presidents making a start on doing this. Who do you think should take responsibility for, GDPR as a whole in each club?
I think the club office. I mean, at the end of the day, we have a club officer organisation, and the president is the head of that organisation. So while the president delegates a specific role to an individual member, I think it's the president has to support that member, and all the other club officers have to support that member, because I don't think it's just the secretary that's responsible. The secretary may, for example, help to make sure the privacy policy gets uploaded, create all the necessary templates, help complete the templates. But, as a club, we all need to, and especially particularly the president, needs to make sure that we are all following the guidelines around using personal data. So, for example, the VPE and the VPM, for example, will be contacting members and guests all the time. So we need to make sure that while the secretary may lay down the principles and the policies, that they're actually followed. And I think everybody on the officer team, I guess particularly the president and VP, have a responsibility to make sure that happens. So it's the president obviously leads the specific tasks about making sure that the right resources are available. It could be given to the club secretary, but I think all of the club officers whose day-to-day role is about contacting members and guests, ensuring that we're using data for the right reasons, they all need to be on board.
Okay, perfect. Now, this is a teaser for you, or a challenge. Stefania has asked, she might have missed the conversation before, how would be compliant with GDPR regarding existing members and new members in a nutshell. So before you answer the question, I think for Stefania's benefit and everybody else, this recording will be available after the webinar has finished. So if it was something that you want to know about previously, then you can hear it again. But over to you, Jason. So in a nutshell, how will we be compliant with GDPR regarding existing members and new members in a nutshell?
Wow. Okay. So, that's a very difficult question. I guess in a nutshell, ensure that you have permission to contact somebody. So if we are emailing someone who's attended to a meeting, after a meeting, let's ensure that we have their consent to contact them. If we are chasing a member for their membership dues, let's make sure that our club policies allow us to do that, and we make it very clear that we're going to do it. So in a nutshell, make sure you've got the right lawful basis for contacting people. Make sure you tell people what you're going to do with their personal data. And then make sure that you keep records of your processes and your policies. So if anyone ever has a look at what you're doing with personal data, you can show them your documents, because the documents will kind of give the impression that you know what GDPR is and you're following it to the best of your ability.
Well, Jason, I didn't think you'd be able to do that in a nutshell in such a short space of time, but that was amazing. Thanks very much. And Roy has also just reiterated, he says, first of all, have a policy, 2, have permission, and ideally get it signed. He's also said it's an awesome talk, Jason, and he got to hand it to you.
Thanks a lot, Roy. He said he's going to run off to another TM thing. That's the guy who's really dedicated on a Sunday evening. Brilliant. Well, I've got on this slide, there's lots of links. I know we're as Toastmasters, we're getting into Slack, although I've kind of been into it for a bit of a while. So if there's ever a Slack channel for GDPR, we'll get these files on there. But it's all good.
We're Slack fans.
Slack fans. So there's lots of resources here. We've got the ICO has got great resources. There's resources in the GDPR Slack group. We've got privacy notices, all those kind of things there. So if anybody wants to follow up, there's the links are there. And I think to end, I'd just like to say that trust is earned when action meets words. So the words we've got in our privacy policies, in our consent statements, as long as we're living up to those words, then really we shouldn't really have any problems with GDPR.
Okay, perfect. There was just one last question that I'll very quickly. How can we get consent from members that are not attending meetings? I think you covered that earlier on, didn't you, Jason? So that will be in the replay.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, if someone's not attending in a meeting, they're a member, we've got a legitimate interest to contact them to find out why they're not attending a meeting. And if they decide they want to leave, that's something we can manage, because but if you don't contact them, you can't manage them. And there's got to be, there's a bit of common sense to say, we've got a legitimate interest because this member's signed and they have suggested they want to be a member. If they're not attending, we should find out what their status should be and get that clarified. Okay.
Well, thanks very much, Jason. I think we've all learned a lot about GDPR on this session. And if we can't remember it, then as I said, it will be replayed and you'll get a link to it. So
perfect. Brilliant. I'd like to just thank everybody for taking the hour to learn a little bit about GDPR. I hope it's not been too dull. I've tried to liven it up and keep it as summarized as possible, but feel free to stay in touch. I'm sure there'll be lots of news around GDPR as the ICO gets staffed up and the fines start getting doled out. We'll know a little bit more about how it's actually going to work in practice. Thank you all very much. Cheers.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you. Good night to everybody. And everybody says thank you. Okay.
Good night,
Good night everyone.
Bye.